It is clearly, I can tell you this tonight, the clues and the signs and the evidence of a turning point in the Mueller probe. We are seeing indications that he is moving towards some kind of finish line. Let me show you the latest signal. It's from the president, a man who's been under scrutiny for 2 years, struck a tone that I'll let you decide for yourself, but he looked almost deliberately blasé about how this Mueller report could come out soon.
Mr. President, should the Mueller report be released over a broad ministry?
That'll be totally up to the new Attorney General. He's a tremendous man, a tremendous person who really respects this country and respects the Justice Department. So that'll be totally up to him, the new Attorney General.
Totally up to him. As if this was not a president who gets involved. Donald Trump famously wanted to fire Jeff Sessions for not defending him enough against this lawful Russia probe. Now he claims he's hands off, but it's his hand-picked attorney general who, of course, will decide all of this. Now, if you look at the president there, and we don't do a lot of body language on this show, but he at least seems to be playing a role of someone who doesn't want to look tense. He seems like a man trying to evince a certain lack of worry about where this is headed. And none of this is in a bubble. This was just 6 days ago that we got the vision of Bill Barr being sworn in as the new attorney general, facing there the Chief Justice and the man who he's investigating and the man that Mueller has been investigating. Now, last night, Trump officially nominated Barr's deputy to replace the man who had been overseeing this, the most famous deputy attorney general in American history, Rod Rosenstein. Meanwhile, NBC reported that Rosenstein would only step down, he'd only leave after Mueller finished his work. Now, today, that's not all. As I mentioned, the clues. We're interested in the evidence, not the rumors. The clues that Mueller might be wrapping things up comes from here. A report by CNN that on 3 different days last week, there were workers in Mueller's office carrying boxes, pushing a cart of files out of their office, and that the grand jury which indicted Stone, Manafort, and others has not actually met in weeks. The last thing they did were the charges against Stone. And in some of the big cases that are moving forward, we see the other offices that could take, it's like football, they could take a handoff. And then you have all this other action that I want to tell you about today before we bring in our experts. A New York judge granting Michael Cohen more time before he reports to prison based on a surgery, and his lawyer saying he is still preparing to testify. Important note, this was a prosecution that originally began, of course, with the Mueller probe, ended up back in New York. Roger Stone goes face-to-face tomorrow with a judge that he at least mocked online, maybe worse. The question is whether he violated the gag order. And he's not just being prosecuted again by Mueller's office. The handoff. Lawyers at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office are involved. They can continue if Mueller wraps up. Now, Stone has been, of course, on this nonstop media blitz over the last few weeks, and he claimed memorably that he felt this was overboard. This was somehow a problem. The lawful arrest that you see on your screen at his home in Florida when they executed the lawful arrest warrant. But compare that video of Stone's arrest with his own online attacks on this federal judge who will decide tomorrow his fate, and you can assess for yourself what was really inappropriate, what was really a potential threat. So tomorrow is a big, big day in the Mueller probe no matter what. But what we don't know tonight is if it could be one of the last big days, one of the last big hearings while Mueller is still formally on the job. So let's get into it with people who know their way around these very intricate issues. Former federal prosecutor John Flannery, Anne-Marie McAvoy, a former federal prosecutor who also represented Donald Trump's deputy campaign chair, Rick Gates, in the Mueller probe and brings that important, relevant experience. And for the wider view of the politics of all this, because the ending of any Mueller probe is going to have a lot of political reaction, the man who used to run the Democratic Party, a governor, a doctor, Howard Dean. How you doing, Governor?
I'm doing great.
Nice to see you. We're going to get to you. Flannery, I begin with you. Based on the clues, stipulating what we don't know, what do you see as significant about where this is headed now?
Well, you know, I had a different reaction. When you talked about all the documents being packed up and leaving the office, all I could think of was Watergate, in which the team, Rick Benveniste and others, they took documents out of the office because they feared what would happen to the office if it would be shut down and all that they had gotten would be lost. So I don't know. I mean, there have been so many advances in terms of search warrants and data that they found. It still doesn't feel like they would do it except out of compulsion to issue a report now. And I think it's an evolving thing. I think the way any investigation works is you get a more and more precise picture as time goes on. And I'm sure Mueller has worked that way. But
now,
whether or not he's going to have a report imminently, I don't know
we
about
press
that.
everyone around here, John. Are you analyzing or are you hoping?
No, I think I'm analyzing. Why would all these documents leave his office when there's not a court proceeding that requires them, like, say, the Alexandria trial? That doesn't make sense to me. And so I'm analyzing the facts as you have them available and presented them.
With a grin to boot.
Yes, I'm a happy guy.
Well, you know, he's a happy lawyer. Anne-Marie, I think John is making what for many critics of Donald Trump would be the best case scenario, and the idea that there's a lot more to go on. What we do here is report the way things look. And there is evidence, as I've just gone through, that there's at least a possibility of Mueller wrapping up without more indictments. It doesn't mean there might not be a report with all kinds of bad stuff about Donald Trump, stuff that the House might want to consider, a lot of activities that, if basically taken by any other human, they would be called obstruction of justice. And the question is, what does our constitutional system do when the president's that human? But what do you think? Do you see it a little differently? You are the person on the panel who's interacted with these Mueller folks.
I think there's a very good chance that it may be winding down, although it's very difficult to say. We're always reading the tea leaves, trying to figure out what's happening. They do have a new attorney general. The attorney general is now in charge of this investigation. Mueller reports up to him. He may say enough and shut it down. We're done. And that may well be why they're taking boxes out. But it may also be that it will continue for some time. It's very hard to tell. As
a prosecutor, you deal with all kinds of people trying to break the law and get away with it, crime and cover-up. Listen to another celebrated attorney who rose all the way to acting director of the FBI, who everyone's heard from this week, because he put it in rather stark terms, not backward-looking about what Andy McCabe says he saw in his book, but really the criminal overlap that he saw in the way Trump does business. Take a look.
This is classic kind of criminal enterprise behavior, right? You have a strong leader who rules by force of will and personality, who demands unquestioned loyalty from those people around him. He's got to be sure that people are on his side. If you're not on his side, you're against him. And if you don't have that, it's a threat to his very existence. Those are some of the same traits that I saw interacting with the president and the folks in his administration.
What's notable about that is not mere criticism. That is not just punditry. That is a window into the mindset of someone who actually at one point was making sure there was an investigation of this president. What you heard from him, does that sound to you like the way that the prosecutors and the investigators you dealt with in this probe were approaching this? Or could this wrap up with them saying, look, there's a lot of stuff we don't like, but we're not calling it a criminal enterprise?
It's hard to say. I mean, I only dealt with the Rick Gates issues as far as with the special counsel's team. So we didn't talk about anything other than that. But you have to remember, too, when you're looking at McCabe, the Inspector General found that he lied on a number of instances, and he's trying to portray things in a way that's favorable to him, so people also feel sorry for him. And
do you think well, since you bring it up, do you think he's lying now?
It's hard to say. I mean, this is a guy who's lied so many times, you sort of lose.
Well, it's not that hard to say. I mean, I'm asking you point blank. Are you just mentioning something to discredit him, or are you saying that what he says now is lying? I would appreciate a straight answer.
I don't trust him. I tend to be a little cynical. I'm a former prosecutor. When somebody's lied a few times under oath, I no longer trust what they say. So I would then take everything that they say without putting a lot of stock into it. And I also look at the fact of what circumstance he's in, and he's in a circumstance right now where he's trying to get himself out of trouble because there was a criminal referral. Because
there's still the open probe in D.C.
Absolutely.
I think that's an important context you bring. Right. Governor Dean, your views on any and all of the above, as well as how it's going to play in a town that has become obsessed with strong reactions to whatever comes out of the FBI.
I think it's too early to say. I mean, we love to speculate about this because it's certainly high drama, particularly when McCabe said that he thought that he had an investigation to see if the president of the United States was a Russian asset. That's something we've never heard in the history of the Republic, as far as I can tell, or any other foreign asset. But we just don't know. I mean, Mueller's run a very professional, quiet investigation with virtually no leaks whatsoever. And we can speculate all we want, but there is actually, unfortunately, very little evidence to come to any conclusion, I think, at this point about what's going to be in the investigation and when it's going to appear.
Let me ask you, John, on Roger Stone, which is another big piece of this. And again, you can do the thought experiment. If an aide to George Bush or Barack Obama was indicted for all this terrible stuff and then basically went and did these in really remarkably irresponsible attacks on the judge, and now tomorrow the judge is going to rule, and to put it in simple terms, he could get a warning, he could get an even more restrictive gag order, he could get, you know, an ankle bracelet, kind of like the rapper Rick Ross, if you remember his ankle bracelet. He could get a fine, or he could get jail. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, if I were the judge, and I'm sure the judge has considered this, part of his story is that some aide did this, that is suggesting, you know, he calls it a Celtic cross, a bullseye for a rifle shoot, next to a picture which certainly wasn't originally with that, and some aide did that without consulting with him. I'd want that person on the carpet to tell me if that conversation happened, because I don't believe a thing that comes out of his mouth. I don't think anybody else does either. The trickster, the liar, the manipulator, and he probably never expected it would get caught up, that he would get away with it. And then when he did, he took it down but put up the picture again, then took down the picture and then apologized when he was caught. And these conversions on the edge of being punished are important. So if I were the judge, I would be scrutinizing pretty carefully what he has to say, not believing anything, and have to be persuaded. And I would consider obviously changing the conditions of his release, no matter what he said. But on top of that, if I suspected that he was lying, as is his course, I think that I might suggest he spend a couple of days at the federal expense instead of wherever he's living right now.
Right. I mean, any time in jail might disabuse him of the notion that this is a set and a platform for publicity. Anne-Marie, when you had your client dealing with this, it doesn't seem that he followed advice to go out and hold all these press conferences and do it for the gram, as they say. And your client here is one of the people that is guilty. I want to put this in terms of what we've learned. You have Manafort guilty, Gates guilty, who you represented, Flynn guilty, Stone indicted, and of course all the Russian nationals indicted. In your view, having interacted with this, if this is where it ends, was this still a really big deal? Or does this look to you like something that you would argue, while serious, is a lot of cover-up and what they call process crimes and not the underlying collusion?
Well, it doesn't have a lot to do with Russia, and it doesn't seem to. None of it seems to go back to Trump. They don't seem to make that connection between Trump himself. So they don't seem to have that. It's serious crimes that he's committed. The photo that he put with the crosshairs could be looked at as a threat to the judge or to incite some sort of violence against her. If she looks at it that way, that's very serious too, and all of that will affect eventually, if he is found guilty or if he pleads guilty, the sentencing. So he could be looking at some serious time, and the fact that he did this now makes it worse.
Governor Dean, big picture, and if there is, quote unquote, no election conspiracy, no collusion, what do you take from this? Is your argument, is the Democrats' argument, yeah, okay, there wasn't an international Watergate election conspiracy, there was just a ton of felonies by all of the top people Trump picked?
Yeah, you know, I don't think the stench of the Trump family corruption is going to go away no matter what happens. I think if he gets indicted, or if many of his people get indicted, there may be impeachment hearings, depending on how much evidence there is. But, you know, Trump's label is now corruption, and his base is going to love him anyway, and everybody else is going to hate him. And I don't see a big change in the status quo. I do think there are a number of people who are going to jail, and I wouldn't rule out Donald Jr.
Very interesting. Anne-Marie, I should mention that Andy McCabe is going to be on the beat tomorrow night. Do you want me to tell him you said hi?
I wish him well. I hope it all works out for him. He's in a lot of hot water. I mean,
it was it was a little bit more of a joke question.
I know.
But you're answering it seriously, and you're a serious prosecutor. I get it.
But yeah, he's got a lot to deal with. No question of that.
Well, you can't argue a case unless you hear every side. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.